Welcome to everyone who's joining the call. We're excited for the webinar today. We'll give people a couple more minutes before we dive in. All right, I think we can go ahead and get started. Want to make sure that people can join, but that we have enough time to get through all the great content that we have for everyone today. So thank you to everyone who's joined the webinar thus far. My name is Emily Pobita. I'm the Director of Corporate Partnerships at American Forests. And we're really excited to talk to you about our REPLANT work today. Aspiration is a really wonderful partner that we've been working with, and we are thrilled to have them supporting our REPLANT work. So today we're going to be diving into the historic impact of the REPLANT Act, which is a really wonderful policy win for American forests, but also a great just policy win generally. And thanks to this new funding and policy direction, we're really set up to transform our approach to reforestation work. So think about our large landscapes here. Place yourself in our national parks, your rural ecosystems, and we're really thrilled to announce that we have this 5-year Keystone Agreement worth $20 million with this REPLANT Act funding that my colleague Brian Kittler is going to dive into here. So I'll turn it over to Chad for a few remarks on the aspiration side of things before we kick things off on the presentation.
Awesome. Thank you, Emily. And good morning, good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Chad Hunter, Head of Sustainability here at Aspiration, which many of you know is a climate-friendly banking alternative with the mission to help individuals fight climate change while enhancing their financial well-being. And also, you probably all know that one of our key features is the pay what is fair option, which allows our customers to choose how much they pay for our services each month, and then in turn helps make climate-friendly banking accessible to all. And then within that pay what is fair, we take 10% of that and donate it to environmental nonprofits, which is why I'm here today. I'm particularly excited about the partnership we have with American Forests. They're our current donation partner. We started this partnership back in June to support the incredible work that they're doing, and that Brian's going to talk a little bit more in depth today. So really excited for the conversation. And so with that, I'll hand it back over to Emily and Brian and get into the fun stuff.
Thanks, Chad. I'm just going to do a quick introduction here of my colleague Brian Kittler, who is American Forest Chief Program Officer of Resilient Forests, this large area of our programmatic work, and has joined American Forest in 2020. So he's been here for a while and has an extreme wealth of knowledge on this topic, and is really excited to present to you all today. So Brian, please take it away. And I'll also just mention, one more thing. If you have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. We'll be monitoring it, and we'll do some Q&A after Brian's presentation.
Thanks, Emily. Thanks, Chad. I'm really pleased to be here today. I'm going to pull up my slides here in just a second. But so I lead American Forest's large landscape restoration program called Resilient Forests. As Emily alluded to, I've been with our organization for 5 years, going on 5 years. You know, we are the longest running forest organization in the United States. We're coming up on 150 years of forest conservation and restoration. And today we are building a movement for forest landscape restoration in our cities and in our rural landscapes because American Forest believes that every person deserves the essential life-sustaining benefits that trees and forests provide. Right?
Brian, can I just pause you for a second? I think that
Yes.
the screen that you're sharing is coming up as just half a screen. Can you share the full presentation?
Yes, apologies. I don't know what
That's
was going
okay.
on there. But thank you for letting me know. Okay, can you guys see that okay?
It's still showing as it must be your view of it. There we go. Perfect.
Okay. Apologies for that. So just to jump back in, American Forest, again, we are the longest running forest organization in the country, and creating resilient forests in our urban landscapes so that everyone can enjoy the life-sustaining benefits of trees to protect our most vulnerable populations from extreme heat is one of our main goals. Another one of which is restoring large landscapes. That's the program that I oversee. I'm going to be talking today about our partnership with the U.S. Forest Service to accelerate implementation of the REPLANT Act. And the REPLANT Act is a provision of the infrastructure law that was passed in 2021 that is dramatically increasing the activity on the national forest for climate resilient reforestation. So just to jump into my program, Resilient Forests, we have been active in one way, shape, or form since the early 90s. This is our reforestation program within American Forests. Our program both actively restores forests through partnerships like the one we have with Aspiration and our partnership with the U.S. Forest Service. And we also advocate for new policies that will enable us to take this work to scale. So a perfect example of that is the REPLANT Act. American Forests also is very, very active in the forest climate solution space. So last week, I was in New York City for Climate Week, talking all about this work, the partnerships that we have with corporations, with agencies, with other nonprofits, really leveraging resources to maximize the contribution of our forests in this country to address climate change. We also advance examples on the ground through cutting edge science. We have a large carbon modeling program. Right now, we're optimizing the effect of forest management and forest restoration for California's climate goals. We'll be releasing a report later this year detailing that. And lastly, I think a critical part of what American Forest does is create new innovative approaches to funding and financing this work. Back 30 years ago, we essentially initiated this whole concept of corporate partnerships for reforestation. And today we're modernizing that concept to address the growing need on our national forests and other public and tribal lands. So all told, since this program has been active since the early 90s, we've collectively planted or naturally regenerated about 80 million trees across 170,000 acres in all 50 states and in 43 countries. So a lot of work that we're really proud of. And today we are looking at a real need for reforestation on our public and our tribal nation lands in this country. Collectively, there's an opportunity to reforest and add trees back into these landscapes about the size of the state of West Virginia. So if we can get this right on our public lands and with our tribal nations, we can create a model for resilient reforestation across all lands in the United States and beyond. So we believe that starting there with our public lands and in partnership with tribal nations, we can create this cutting-edge climate-informed reforestation template that just will get replicated, not just here in the United States, but globally. And we're having some real success. You can see here on the map on the left, these are all projects, those kind of points on the dot, those green dots, those are all recent reforestation projects that American Forest has led. You can see a lot of the activity in the Western US, When we talk in a minute about fire and its as a driver of reforestation, that's where a lot of that work is happening. And collectively this year, we are reforesting or naturally regenerating about 21,000 acres, and that's with about 7 million trees. And we're not just involved at that stage of reforestation, sort of the actual regeneration. We are doing all the pre-work that's needed to get us to that point. So this year, we're actually growing about 3.4 million seedlings at private nurseries in the Pacific Northwest. And those are seedlings that we're going to be planting on national forests in 2026 and 2027. So we're involved at that early stage of getting the reforestation engine revving up. The other part of that is really making sure that we've got the seed that we need to grow those seedlings. So American Forests and our partners have been very active this year in seed collection on the West Coast. It was a bumper year for seed collection, and we are stockpiling essentially the seed for the forests of the future that we'll be using for decades to come. Our work also dovetails into applied research. We do a lot of on-the-ground monitoring and assessment of how well the reforestation treatments are working, what the changes that are happening with climate change mean for our approach and our strategy to reforestation and regeneration. And we're also involved in really at a landscape scale, thinking through what those strategies need to look like. So utilizing that science, that traditional ecological knowledge from tribes, local knowledge from stakeholders working within these landscapes to develop comprehensive restoration strategies for some very, very large projects. So all of that rolls up into a much more developed program than even American Forest had, I would say, 10 years ago. So we are scaling up this work, we're building the momentum, and a lot of that is coming through with a number of new partnerships with the U.S. Forest Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, other federal agencies, with tribal nations, again, all to build towards that large goal of reforesting up to 17 million acres of public and tribal nation lands. And we know we've got a big challenge ahead of us. The map here shows from 2000 to 2022, mega fires across the Western United States. And now a mega fire is a fire that's over 100,000 acres. So this isn't all fire activity. This is just the really, really large fires that we've had in the last 22 years or 24 years. So as we've seen an increase in fire, that may not be the best indicator of the challenges that our landscapes are facing. It's certainly an indicator. But what gets me really concerned and what gets those in forest restoration and ecology really concerned is the amount of high severity fire. And what I mean by that, it's the fires that are essentially deforesting the landscape. So it's a fire where you would have all the live trees essentially die. You've lost that seed source, and you've essentially undercut the natural ability of the forest to self-regenerate. When we get into that situation, that's when we come in with our reforestation work and our climate resilient work. So all told, across the West Coast, we've got about 2.75 million acres of recent high severity fires. That's an area of land about 2.5 times the size of Rhode Island. Those are recently deforested lands that need active regeneration and reforestation treatments. And that's affecting all lands, but certainly the biggest challenge ahead of us is with our national forests. So that amount of high severity fire in a national forest is a fairly recent occurrence. 2020 and 2021 were a real wake-up call for us. And we said, with the amount of deforestation that's happened driven by fire, we need a new policy. So that's where American Forest said, working across the aisle with Republicans and Democrats, we authored, introduced, and eventually got passed the REPLANT Act. And the REPLANT Act does a couple different things. It's a policy that creates a expanded funding source for the U.S. Forest Service. The Reforestation Trust Fund of the agency, it's been in place for decades. Now that trust fund has always been capped at $30 million a year. So REPLANT actually lifts that cap. And that funding comes in to the agency through tariffs on imported lumber, primarily through Canada. So the funding into the trust fund does fluctuate year to year. But now, since we've lifted the cap, we are forecasting about $200 million a year being available to the Forest Service in perpetuity for restoration work on our national forests. So we're really, really excited about that because it creates a perpetual funding source that we can build a program around. We can address the atrophy within our reforestation program within the Forest Service and bring to scale all of this climate resilient reforestation to address the situation that you're viewing on the map right here. And American Forest is really excited that we're leading in that. We're not just passing the policy, creating the idea for it, we're actually implementing it. So a year ago, we signed a keystone agreement with the Forest Service. And what that agreement is going to do, it's leveraging American Forests, our thought leadership, to help the agency prioritize and develop 10-year implementation plans for each region of the country. And in those implementation plans, it's going to enable the Forest Service to identify very specifically what activities that are needed to scale our reforestation work across the national forests. So we've also designed our Keystone Agreement around actually carrying out that implementation plan work. So we've been building our own workforce, hiring lots of people joining our organization and our partners to start building that workforce and implementing more of these reforestation projects on the ground. And all that work is guided by science. AF has developed a unique brand of assessment work where we utilize the best available scientific information on climate change, how climate change is affecting forests, looking at the shifting of seed sources into the future so that we're planting the right seed for the right location for that future climate. And we're also doubling down on monitoring. We know that the trees that we plant today need to survive for decades into the future. So monitoring how well the forest is recovering is critical to that work. So that's a fixture in our Keystone Agreement with the Forest Service. It's having the resources in place to do that monitoring at scale. And the last piece is really kind of hones in on AF's American Forest theory of change around reforestation. And that's that we can't just focus on the act of planting trees. We have to invest in the entire supply chain of activities before and after the planting of trees to ensure that we create a resilient forest for the future. So that's building the workforce that we need to do that work. It's making sure that we've got enough seed stockpiled, that we actually have enough nursery space to grow all the seedlings, and that we have an adequate workforce to do all that planting. So our supply chain framework is really built around that. And my entire Resilient Forest program now has sort of been reconfigured around 9 steps in that supply chain. So it all begins with partnerships, like the partnerships that we have in our Keystone Agreement with the Forest Service, and also partnerships with individual national forests. Those also extend to our partnerships, certainly with corporations that support this work, as well as individuals. The second stage of this work is that planning stage. And I've already sort of referenced that American Forest has a unique brand of doing that. We like to work collaboratively with local organizations, with tribal nations, land managers, private landowners, public land managers, to develop comprehensive restoration plans that can guide restoration work for multiple years. And then steps 3 and 4, once we do all that planning work, we sort of have a better sense for how much reforestation is needed. That really tells us how much seed do we need and how many seedlings do we need to grow and plant on an annual basis to meet the goals of our restoration plans. So with seed collection, American Forest has really led in developing a workforce in our Home Core program to collect the seed that we need. So Home Core was built up in California first in response to a massive uptick in fire in that state. And since then, we've been able to bring on 25 people every year to get trained in seed collection and then get deployed out there in the field to actively collect seed that's now being used in reforestation. Seedling partnerships are huge for us. We work with public nurseries, private nurseries, to grow enough of the seedlings that we need and the right type of seedlings that we need to do this resilient reforestation work. And then steps 5 through 9 are really what I think we all tend to think of with regards to reforestation. It's the on-the-ground process of preparing sites for planting, making sure that we've got a site that's going to be conducive to growing seedlings and sustaining that regenerating forest, and then actually getting out there and actively planting and maintaining those sites into the future so that we're not just planting the trees, we're seeing them through to vigorous growth, and especially in the Western US, vigorous growth that can sustain that next fire. Because we know that fire is going to come back, and we actually do want fire back into our forests, in our dry Western forests, but we want the right type of fire so that we will continue to have a healthy forest there into the future. So at a high level, our goals with our REPLANT initiative and our Keystone Agreement with the Forest Service are this. So again, we're expanding that supply chain solutions framework because we know that we need to expand the entire supply chain if we're going to get more reforestation on the ground. And all told, across our national forest, we've got about 3.6 million acres of reforestation that's been verified. So that's people out there ground truthing on the ground, enough reforestation that's equivalent essentially to the size of Connecticut across our national forests. So there's a huge, huge need. The second thing with our Keystone Agreement and partnership with the Forest Service is all about creating that workforce. So American Forests, we are staffing up in a big way so that we can lead on the ground projects with the Forest Service on national forests all over the country. And just doing business as usual, we know is not good enough, right? We know this work is expensive, and we want to actually invest in strategies that are going to bring down that cost. So changing the economics at the end of the day is really root to the projects that we are designing right now and taking on. And lastly, you know, we're also needing to grow the movement around this work. There is not enough attention being paid in our minds to the challenges of our national forests at large and our broader public lands. And so communicating our progress, celebrating our progress, that's a big part of what we're doing. And indeed, there's some really exciting things I want to share this morning that since passage of the REPLANT Act, the Forest Service has actually been able to address 15% of its reforestation backlog. So again, passage of the REPLANT Act, we had about 3.6 million acres of reforestation need, and we've already been able to implement about 15% of that. So there's been a big progress in just a few years, and in part that's coming through partnerships like their partnership with American Forests. So in terms of our strategic interventions, you know, I mentioned our supply chain partnerships. That's not just American Forests leading. You know, we're working very closely with tribal nations that have lands adjacent to the public lands and or the public lands are their ancestral lands. We work very closely with state agencies, private industry, other nonprofit organizations, and we are collectively building and implementing a set of projects together across our national forests. And this year, really excited that we've been collaboratively implementing those projects across 5 national forests all over the Western US. And the last point I want to make here is we know that the fundamental premise of a large new program like the REPLANT Act coming forward, it signals that there's new money, but just want to double down on the fact that the REPLANT Act at $200 million a year, that's only going to get us about 25% of the dollars that we need to reforest the national forest. So we need to look at innovative restoration financing. We need to look at private philanthropy at a scale that we've never seen before. And we are really excited about some signals that we've got, especially coming out of last week, Climate Week. There's some real interest and attention to forests as a climate solution and reforestation on our public lands in particular. So I want to kind of conclude by giving you guys a sense for really what this looks like on the ground. Was really excited about our partnership with Aspiration. And when we started that partnership, we were looking at a landscape that was emblematic of the challenges the National Forests are facing, but also emblematic of how the REPLANT Act and the partnership that American Forest has with the Forest Service can be carrying out and addressing the restoration work on our national forests. So the Creek Fire is a unique example. The Creek Fire is a 2020 fire. And again, remember that 2020 and 2021 were watershed years for fire on our national forests. We saw in 2020 over 1 million acres of fire across the state of California, and a third of that came in the Creek Fire. So the Creek Fire all told was about 380,000 acres. About 41% of the fire burned at high severity. And several thousand people were evacuated for weeks on end, including Britta Dyer on our staff. She was evacuated for 6 weeks in a row. And, you know, while the fire was catastrophic and, you know, the smoke plume and the evacuations get a lot of attention for a relatively short period of time, we are now dealing with multiple years and if not decades of restoration work that needs to happen in this landscape going forward. So, and this is what it looks like. This was a part of the Creek Fire that burned at high severity. And again, about 41% of that fire, that 380,000 acres, saw high severity fire. This was actually a high severity reburn. This was an area of the Creek Fire that had previously burned in the French Fire. So how we come back from this, how we make the intentional choices of where we invest resources really, really, really matters. This is activity with our fires that is at a scale that historically we have not seen. Historically, we would see about 10 acres in the Sierra Nevada mountains being a high severity patch, and now we're seeing maybe 50,000 acres. So it's a big change that's happening out there in our landscape, and it's going to require sort of a big change in how we're operating. And to that point, the U.S. Forest Service has field-leading, international leading science. And American Forests has been utilizing that science in our restoration program. So General Technical Report 270, I'm going to get real wonky on you guys for just a minute. GTR 270 provides a post-fire restoration framework for all of California. And it's rooted in 6 science-based principles. So restoring key ecological processes, considering the landscape context. So in this case, 380,000 acres that burned. Promoting regional native biodiversity. So bringing back forest ecosystems that are natural and sustaining diverse ecosystem services. Our national forests provide drinking water to 60 million people. So ensuring that we're continuing to provide drinking water, biodiversity, carbon reduction benefits, establishing and prioritizing management interventions. So really thinking about that large landscape and starting to chunk out bits and pieces where you can actually do this restoration work on the ground. And then lastly, incorporating adaptations to climate change and other agents of change. So we looked at this framework and we worked very closely with the Sierra National Forest. The Sierra National Forest is the national forest that was affected by the Creek Fire. And American Forest was really excited to see that as the forest developed a response plan to the Creek Fire, they actively integrated GTR 270. So those 6 principles were actively integrated. American Forest supported them in that process, providing letters of support and some guidance as they were doing this development phase. And in 2022, the agency made a final decision on how it was going to proceed with the restoration. So we have been partnering with the Sierra National Forest for a long time. On previous fires, like the French Fire, we collaborated and planted hundreds of thousands of seedlings with them. And we're just getting going on the Creek Fire. So I was really excited that this year, through our partnership with Aspiration, we've planted 145,000 seedlings in a first 640,000 acre reforestation project just south of Yosemite National Park on the Sierra National Forest. So this is the first of many projects to come in the creek fire restoration. Again, these large fires take a long, long time. American Forest has been involved in the King Fire on the El Dorado National Forest, essentially since, I believe it was 2017 where we got started. And this year, we're just almost wrapping up our last reforestation partnership on that one fire. So while this is, the first of many, we're really excited to see the work progressing on the creek fire. So the other big thing that we did this year in our partnership with the Sierra and other national forests in California was collect seed. So for every corporate partnership that we now have in our REPLANT initiative, we're not just planting trees, we're also collecting seed. So investing in our Cone Core program, we were able to get out there and collect thousands of bushels of seed this year. And each of those cones has a number of seeds in them that are then extracted, they're stockpiled, and then they're grown into seedlings that we'll be using for decades to come. And we collected enough seed this year to reforest hundreds of thousands of burn lands. So it was a real unique year on the West Coast. So with all that being said, the work on the creek fire is going to continue. Here's a map of our current REPLANT initiative partnerships with the Forest Service. You can see the area in brown. Those are all the acres that we need to reforest. So these 2 years, 2024, again, it was a big year. We planted about a little over 6,000 acres in California alone with the Forest Service. And next year, we're going to be doing even more across all over the country. So again, these are resilient reforestation treatments. We're not just involved in the act of planting, we're actively planning these projects, we're collecting the seed that we need, and we are maintaining these sites until that forest can stand up on its own and withstand the next fire. So thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Brian. That was so energizing and inspiring. I know as one of your colleagues, I'm always so privileged to get to hear this kind of webinar and conversation, but it's always so energizing and exciting, despite the severity of some of those burn scars. So I think we'll take a moment here to open things up for questions. If anyone has anything, feel free to put it in the chat. Raise your hand. We can come off mute and ask a question that way as well. So we'll open it up to the group. I know we had one come through a little bit earlier as a direct message. So let's start with that one then. Brian, can you tell us a little bit more about what success for this program might look like in the next couple of milestones, whether that's 5 years, 10 years, along that line?
Yeah, as you can tell, 3.6 million acres is a lot of land, and we were really excited that we're at about 15% of that. Success to me looks like by 2034, 100% that we've actually addressed the full backlog on the national forest with resilient reforestation treatments. And to get there, it's an ever increasing amount of activity every year. So American Forest has been in a building mode. We have brought on a lot of new staff that are developing projects on the ground right now with the national forests, and we want to see those projects implemented in the coming years. I could say more, but that's already a lot. And I'll just say one last thing, which is all that seed that we have collected this year, starting to pair that up with the existing restoration need, right? So making sure that we're seeing orders coming into our nurseries, that we're seeing each phase of that supply chain really humming. and that we're seeing growth across the system.
That's fantastic. I'm seeing a few questions in the chat coming in here, wondering if there's any programs to get involved in West Virginia, near the, I'm going to mispronounce this, but the Monongahela National Forest that's in West Virginia there.
Yeah, so I think, there was another question up above about volunteer opportunities and partnerships. One of the best things that we can do as people in the United States is to volunteer and realize that these are public lands, right? These are lands held in the trust of the United States, and there's different ways that we can get involved. When I graduated college, I spent the summer volunteering with public lands, and that looked like I was out there doing trail stewardship. With regards to reforestation, just familiarizing ourselves with the need of your local forest, understanding the forest health that's going on out there, the sort of, if there's any insect and disease issues. There's a big issue in the eastern US, insect and disease. We have fire in the east, but really the fire of the east is insect and disease, right? So monitoring that in your region, understanding those trends, just staying informed. That's like the most important thing that we can all do. I think the other thing that we can do is learn about seed. Acorn production is periodic in the east, so a lot of our work in the east is white oak restoration, and indeed that's on the Monongahela National Forest. That's what we're doing, is white oak restoration with them. So understanding when there's a big acorn year, and just observing that can be helpful. In the West, we've actually developed a tool with the state of California where, because we've had such a need for seed, we want to know when people are seeing seed develop in cones and trees in the conifers of California. So there was an app that was created that allows for landowners, private landowners, to say, hey, I think there's a bumper crop of cones in my sugar pine. Can someone come out here and take a look? So that actually worked this year. We actually had instances where private landowners identified a specific type of cone that we were really looking for. They contacted the state, and we were able to collectively get a forester out there to look at that seed as it was developing and determine whether or not it was a real opportunity. And then we were able to actually collect the ones that were. So I think there's a lot of opportunities for us all to be involved in our public lands. And I would just encourage you to really learn about your local forest and what those best ways are.
Wonderful, Brian. That's great advice. There is a question here as well. Could you share a little bit more about how American Forest goes about the species selection and anything that we're doing to prevent issues like monoculture?
Yeah, there's only, I can think of maybe one instance where we're planting one species, and it's really around restoring that individual species, white bark pine. So that is really, there's, projects where that's all we're planting. And that's a very kind of nuanced issue that deals with a disease that's killing that species. It's about the genetic resistance to that disease that we're trying to bring back in the trees that we're planting. But other than that, everything that we do is based on the natural diversity that exists in our ecosystems. We want to promote that because that's what promotes resilience. That's what we need back, is resilience. I will say that one thing that we have really developed an appreciation for and some expertise in is making sure that we're taking into account the future climate. So assisted population migration is something that American Forest is actively involved in. And that is not moving species of trees from a location that they do not currently exist in, but it's moving the genetics from species small distances, like maybe a little bit uphill or a little bit from the south to the north, to account for future climate, right? So it's not something that's outside the naturally occurring range of that species, but it is adjusting the seed source on the margins to make sure that we are accounting for future drought, we're accounting for changes in precipitation. And that is something that is now becoming more broadly utilized. And actually, the National Forest this year released new policy guidance for the U.S. Forest Service to do assisted population migration through its REPLANT Act. So we're kind of on the cutting edge of that. But I would just, kind of double stamp that promoting diversity is first and foremost something that American Forest does. Monocultures do present some challenges in terms of resilience. I'll just leave it at that.
Thanks, Brian. Speaking of cutting edge techniques and cutting edge things, we have a question here about any mechanization or techniques that we're using to scale up or speed up planting, like drones, anything kind of technology like that. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting and really good question. With drones, where we've utilized drones, it's largely been at the assessment phase. So all of our work actually utilizes remote sensing, so satellite imagery, to give us the best available information about the landscape and about the condition of the forest. With drones, we've been doing some monitoring work. We actually have a drone in California that we've utilized. It's also really great for telling a story. It's one thing for me to show you a picture on the screen of a burn scar. It's another thing for you to be out there and walking for miles upon mile upon mile upon mile and not see a live tree after these fires. So utilizing drones to take that videography, to share that example, is something that American Forest is trying to do more of. The other thing that we've been looking at with drones is whether or not they can be utilized for things like prescribed fire. One of our collaborators, the Washington Department of Natural Resources, they're utilizing drones for prescribed fire. So that's intentionally lighting fires to help keep the forest fuel levels low into the future and to keep that forest resilient. So there's a lot of interesting applications with drones for forest restoration, forest management, and reforestation. And yeah.
Wonderful. Moving to the group here, John Kay, I see you have your hand up. Would you like to ask a question?
Yes, Emily, I sure would. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, can hear you just fine.
Yeah, first, I just want to say I really appreciate this presentation being done for us. It's so nice to know how, for aspiration account holders, how our accounts are contributing to these efforts. And it's just great to see. So Chad, I wanted to thank you for that. It's great. Brian, your presentation triggered several questions in my mind. First of all, I wanted to ask about this. Young trees face a lot of threats. They're vulnerable to a lot of things. You touched on the wildfires, and you also touched on, monitoring that's done to make sure that the young trees are being tended to and healthy and all of that. I just want to know, could you go into a little bit more depth about what steps are being made sure that these trees are going to be resilient in the face of changing climate, dealing with not only wildfire, but also, issues like bark beetle and other types of things that are out there. And a related question is this. You talked about over the last 5 years, all this replanting that has been done in various locations. How long does it take for forests to become mature and absorbing a significant amount of carbon, at least what they're expected to absorb or offset? How long does that take? Maybe you could talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, great question. So with reforestation is perhaps our #1 forest climate solution. And we can't just plant forests back the way they were, right? We have to take into account the future climate, and we have to take into account resilience. So what we're seeing and what we're implementing in our projects in the West is a less dense forest. You know, what was there before had not seen fire in most cases in a long time. So there was a naturally there's a naturally high number of trees per acre in a lot of places, and that's why in part we've had such high severity fires burn. So what we're really trying to do is create a more heterogeneous forest, right? You're gonna have areas that are open with grasses and shrubs without trees. You're gonna have small clumps where you have multiple trees kind of growing in an area. And then you're gonna have single trees interspersed out there across the landscape. That is what nature would do naturally. And that's what we're trying to bring back. So I mentioned GTR 270. That took that principle of sort of natural forest and heterogeneity, and it's really guided our thinking and as we're designing projects. So we are doing plantings that are, they don't look necessarily like the ones that you would maybe think. They're not sort of gridded out lines and lines. There's certainly areas where that is going on, but a lot of what we're really trying to do today is take that principle of diversity and heterogeneity and design planting projects that are creating groups of trees, individuals interspersed, because that's going to be the more resilient forest in the future. The more trees you have per acre, the more drought stress that you're likely to see, the more mortality that you're likely to see. And when it comes to things like beetle infestations, creating a forest that is diverse in its species and its composition allows for both the young trees and the older trees to withstand insect infestations, disease, and fire and drought. So from a climate adaptation perspective, there are things that we can do and intentionally choose at the stage of designing and implementing these projects. In terms of making sure that they're growing to be these old forests that we're really after, that they're going to continue to grow and sequester carbon, we have to manage them, right? We can't just plant these trees and walk away. So maintenance treatments, release treatments, oftentimes will come back immediately after planting. And we'll do things like hand grubbing, which is a technique we implement a lot in California, where you're actually going up and you're removing the competing vegetation with hand tools. So as shrubs come back, we're removing some of the shrubs immediately adjacent to the trees that we planted. And that gives those trees a boost in their growth where they can utilize more of the water that they would otherwise be competing with the shrubs for. I mentioned prescribed fire. Ultimately, what we're trying to do is bring a forest back with enough trees in these Western forest types, with enough trees that are big enough that you can actually bring a fire of low severity back. It'll stay on the ground and not get into the forest canopy. And that'll be the predominant forest management tool going forward. But again, so all of that work from the hand grubbing to the use of prescribed fire, future thinning projects, that's all planned for when we're doing these projects in the Western US primarily. In the East, with forest types like longleaf pine, we're also doing that. And I would say all of American forest projects they're not necessarily just about planting the tree, right? They're about getting that long-term result. The last question, or John, your question about how soon before we see large amounts of carbon being stored. That's a really, really good question. And, we did an analysis of all the provisions of the infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act, the two largest policies ever passed for forests in this country, $20 billion for forests, for forest climate solutions specifically. And what we found is that over the life of 50 years, the reforestation provisions are the ones that will give the biggest benefit. And that's because forests start slow, they're sequestering carbon every year. But if we are getting to the scale of this activity, And if those forests do grow into those mature forests, we're going to see significant volumes of carbon removed, sequestered, stored in a future forest that is resilient. And that is where we see the biggest carbon bang, or the biggest carbon buck.
Awesome. Well, we have a couple more minutes left here, and we did get another question in the chat, so I want to make sure that we can address that before we wrap today. So Brian, can you speak to a little bit more on any new projects that we might be launching in the future, and what regions we might be focusing on moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, if you probably saw on the map, a lot of activity in the West Coast. That is in part a design feature where we've had so much need. We've really built our staff around that need. So we've got a big team in California, a growing team in the Pacific Northwest. But this year, we just brought on someone who will be starting in a couple of weeks in the Southeast. They'll be focused on longleaf pine, shortleaf pine, white oak. And we just brought on someone in the Southern Rockies to complement our staff in the Northern Rockies. Each of these regional directors will be building out a team, and those teams are going to be building out projects with the National Forests. So I anticipate that, well, we've had so much need on the West Coast, and that's where the biggest part of the REPLANT Act is going to happen. I'm anticipating that we'll see a lot of activity in the Southern Rockies and New Mexico, Arizona, and Colorado in the coming years. And that we're going to have some really, really great projects emerge in all of our other regions as well. So stay tuned.
Wonderful. Well, before we wrap here, then I just saw Wesley, your comment here saying that you'd love to see some photos and videos of our projects. I'm just going to drop a link to American Forest's website. Please feel free to check it out. We do have a lot of great case studies there, and a lot of different work that we've done. So thank you for your enthusiasm. And John, I see one more question from you in the chat as well. Brian, I think we have a couple more minutes we could address this, and then we'll wrap. So the question is about aquatic and marine forests being important to sequestering carbon. Is there room in American Forest's future to look into this kind of reforestation as well?
We have done some mangrove projects in the past, and definitely recognize the huge contribution that mangroves do, not just for carbon, but for global fisheries, right? So some of the best projects out there, if successful, are mangrove, for sure. You know, kelp forests, I live in Oregon. You know, the coast is near and dear to my heart, but we've not, as an organization, really looked at investing our efforts in there. We think those are definitely important projects, and but we tend to stay up in the mountains and in the low-lying coastal areas. So, but thank you for your question.
All right. Well, thank you all for attending today. We're very excited to have you here, excited to share about our work with you all, and so appreciate your engagement, all of the thoughtful questions that you asked. Thank you for tuning in today. If you have more questions, please feel free to reach out to myself. My colleague's going to drop a link in the chat to my email. If you have any questions, you're more than welcome to reach out. In closing, I just really want to acknowledge not only Aspiration, but some of the other partners that have made this work really possible. So alongside Aspiration, we have had some great investments from organizations like the Coca-Cola Foundation, Tepper Foundation, Cliff Bar, Eddie Bauer, Takeda, AES. And so we're so proud to leverage not only public support, but private support from these kinds of corporations to invest in the REPLANT initiative. So thank you all again for joining. And if you have, a need to reach out, please do so. And if you're interested in supporting us, I linked our organization homepage, but there's also another link that we can drop in for donations that you can explore, other ways to invest in our organization at your own level, whether that's, you know, as an individual or however you see fit. So please don't hesitate to reach out, and thank you again for joining today and your support of American Forests.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.